All of the measures of poverty we've examined so far have been measures of income, in which someone, using one method or another, sets a poverty line and then estimates how many people have income that put them below that line. But that's a problematic approach, even apart from the methodological challenges that we've seen. How do we set a line? Whose ideas of what's necessary do we use? So one of the very earliest efforts to think differently about what it means to be poor is from one of the founders of modern economics, Adam Smith. So Smith, writing in the 18th century, said the following: "Every man is rich or poor according to the degree to which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. By necessaries, I understand not only the commodities which are indispensably necessary for the support of life, but whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even of the lowest order, to be without. A linen shirt is, strictly speaking, not a necessary of life. The Greeks and Romans lived, I suppose, very comfortably, though they had no linen. But in the present time, through the greater part of Europe, a creditable day laborer would be ashamed to appear in public without a linen shirt, the want of which would be supposed to denote that disgraceful degree of poverty which it is presumed nobody can well fall into without extreme bad conduct." So think for a moment about this way of thinking about poverty, in which it's as much about social and cultural belonging as it is economic, and that it must of necessity, right, vary by time and place. Poverty in this way of thinking means different things to different people, and may even mean different things to different people at different times in their lives. So what would be the equivalent of the linen shirt standard today? This is a related way of thinking from economist Amartya Sen, in which poverty is a lack of freedom, and poverty is the inability of people to live the kinds of lives they value. And pause and read through this. So Smith and Sen both offer relative measures of poverty. Now, there's a less abstract money income based way to measure this too, and it's the most common way that people compare poverty across nations. It's when we've looked at cross national comparisons, it's the method that's been used. Poverty as the number of people with income below either 15% of median income, or for deep poverty, often below 40% of median. Remember, median, right, income means half earned more and half earned less. Right? And this is what we've seen before. That's using that relative poverty standard. And this is how that relative standard compares to the official measure up through 2010. And this is now a comparison of poverty using the OPM, the SPM, and relative measures across different groups. So looking for children, the adults, and the elderly. So as you can see here, right, how you choose to measure a problem can tell you very different things about the scale and scope of it. Now, a related kind of measure is inequality. So here in one chart are a variety of inequality measures, and many of which show how much of all total income or wealth is captured by the highest income earners or the wealthiest Americans. And this, again, back to international comparison, shows that income inequality in comparative terms using what's called the Gini index. And this is a really common measure of inequality. And it puts inequality 0 to perfect equality, 1 perfect inequality. And notice that the US is to be found at the extreme end. And this is looking, again, Gini index, just looking at the US and the trend over the last 40 years. So you can see a pretty steady rise. It's another way of looking at that broader pattern. Green line is showing us pre-tax income for the bottom 50%, and that orange line is for the top 1%. This is now looking at the top 10, 5, and 1% over a much longer period of time. Notice this starts in 1913. You see it peak. Inequality peaks in the 20th century in 1929, just prior to the crash that helped launch the Great Depression. We are now back up to those 1929 levels of income inequality. After you see that trough in the middle, and we've looked at this in a different context, right, of relative equality. The consequences of that inequality play out in a number of different ways. One of the things is that there seems to be a pretty clear correlation between health problems and social problems in more unequal countries, right? And there you see the US once again with very high degree of the health and social problems in those comparator countries and the highest level of income inequality across those countries. And there's also growing evidence that, maybe evidence is too strong a word, there's growing evidence at least establishing the connection between inequality and declining mobility. And I think I think there's probably now, it's safe to say, a consensus among economists that there is a correlation there, even if we're not sure that we entirely understand it. So apart from income poverty, apart from relative poverty and inequality measures, there's still other ways that we could evaluate well-being, right? One of them is insecurity, which in this instance is a way of thinking about how well are people prepared to deal with economic shocks. And this is looking at a study that the Federal Reserve Bank now does on a regular basis. And the top left over there is asking if people are able to cover, if they had a $400 emergency expense, could they do it? And in 2017, 59% said they could, but flip that around. What does that mean? It means that 41% of all Americans could not come up with $400 if they had to. Right, and that on the bottom right there is looking at among those people who could do it, how they're going to do it, right? And it's not necessarily that they've got the cash lying around. And then on the top right is looking at a different measure. It's that whether people have enough savings in the bank, if something horrible should happen and they lose their income for 3 months, do they have enough set aside in emergency savings that they would be able to get by? Half say yes, half say no, right? For the half that say no, that puts them in a really precarious position. So this is another way to see the problem, right? This is savings rates. And notice some of what you're seeing in that latter part of that chart is effects of the Great Recession, but notice that you see that decline starting before the Great Recession hits in 2007, and you see that decline starting in earnest in 1997, 1998 as sort of a smaller level recession. Right, so there are more and more Americans who are feeling this kind of insecurity acutely. That doesn't necessarily show up in poverty measures, right? If you wind up with income above the poverty threshold at the end of the year, you don't show up as poor, but that doesn't tell us anything about what kind of trauma you may have gone through over the course of that year, what worry, what anxiety you may have suffered as you try to figure out how to get by and how to put together that minimal income. Mobility is another useful measure, I think, in which we're not interested in so much in how many people are poor or low income or otherwise in need right now, but in how many people are likely to be able to rise above their current state. This idea of high levels of upward mobility sits at the very heart of the American narrative, right? Work hard, play by the rules. Any boy, any girl can grow up to be whatever they want to be. Except, as we've pointed out before, mobility is actually higher in many other countries than it is in the United States. And this is looking at how well we can predict a son's earnings if the only thing we know is what his father earned. So that correlation, right, that family relationship, it's a better predictor in the United States than it is in France, in Germany, in Japan, in Canada, in Finland, and elsewhere. We don't talk a lot about class in the United States, but we actually have a fairly rigid class structure. And if you're born poor here, you are more likely to die poor here than if you were born poor in lots of other countries, where you would be even less likely to be born poor to begin with, I should point out. And this too has been getting worse over time, as we see here. Fewer poor people moving up and fewer rich people moving down over the course of their lives than was the case in the 1970s. And as you should come to expect, opportunity for mobility varies a lot by geography. And here we can see some of those declines in mobility since the post-war period on the right, nationwide, and some especially sharp declines highlighted in the chart on the left. And the list of alternatives, right, it goes on and on. We could measure well-being by looking at how long people live, right? We still have lower life expectancy than do many, many rich democracies. Here's that pattern over time. As you can see, life expectancy is declining for some groups of Americans while it rises for others. It's that variation among groups that I've pointed out that is so essential to trying to understand the dynamics of what's happening to well-being in the US. And again, lots of variation in life expectancy from place to place. We could even measure well-being by people's self-reported state of happiness. This is actually a burgeoning field of research. This is one measure of the world's happiest countries, and you could pause and take a look through here if you'd like. And there are lots of other ways we could evaluate how people are doing beyond simply counting their income, right? We could measure homelessness, which we're going to talk about at some length. We could talk about hunger. We could talk about access to health care. Or we could talk about child well-being across a range of indicators, and so on and so on, right? It's not to say that we should abandon income measures of poverty, but it is to say that we should be aware of the limits of those kinds of measures and the enormous variety of options that are available to us.